Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to the Wild Vaughn Manor, where Roger and I have returned for the weekend reading report. My weekend reading report. I'm back to report to you all of the exciting stuff that I've been reading. So what did I read last week? And why am I... It's not June. I will explain momentarily. First, we have to talk about all the stuff I've been reading. So what have I been reading anyway? Well, let's talk about this first. I've been reading this in the mornings over coffee. This is Edgar Rice Burroughs, The Man Who Created Tarzan by Erwin Porges, the biography of Edgar Rice Burroughs, which I've been reading for the Edgar Rice Burroughs Deep Dive along with the novels of Edgar Rice Burroughs. So this week, unusually, this is the only Burroughs thing that I've read because some other stuff has been going on. So, what's been going on with Edgar Rice Burroughs in this biography? Well, he's living in California now, and he just has been haggling with different publishers to get The Beasts of Tarzan published. So this is the all-story Cavalier Weekly, where The Beasts of Tarzan was first published, and this is a novel I just read. So I'm reading along in the biography at the same pace that I've been reading his novels. So I've been reading the novels and reading about their creation and their composition at the same time. So that's been kind of cool. So yeah, The Beasts of Tarzan. And he just got Tarzan of the Apes printed in book form for the first time. So that's cool. And so I'm up to, chapter 11. And so the writer at home, he's moving back to Chicago. So that's where I'll be picking up with Edgar Rice Burroughs. Now, I was halfway through a book last week, and I was reading it on this thing. This is one of my Kindles. I've got a couple of them. And this is The End of the Story by Clark Ashton Smith. I was about halfway through, I think, last week, on last week's weekend report. So I finished this book by Clark Ashton Smith, and it was magnificent. What a great book. Clark Ashton Smith, one of the big three who wrote for Weird Tales magazine in the 1930s. What a great writer Clark Ashton Smith is. Fantastic fantasy writer who wrote fantasy, horror, and science fiction. There's actually quite a bit of science fiction in this. Really pulpy, really fun science fiction. And let me pull this up and just talk about some of my favorite stories in this book. This one has some good ones. The Abominations of Yondo, that was good. The Last Incantation is in this. The Last Incantation, about a wizard who longs for a woman from his youth that he knew long ago, who passed away when he was young. And can he bring her back? And what would that be like? And how would that work out? I mean, he is a great sorcerer, and so that was a great story. Probably one of his best shorter stories. The Last Incantation. There's some other good stuff in here. Tons of good stories in this one. The Phantoms of the Fire, the Venus of Azambai. That was interesting. That was an interesting story. The Monster of the Prophecy. That was a science fiction story, kind of a longer science fiction story, which was really kind of interesting and really kind of funny at the same time. The Monster of the Prophecy. That was... You should read that if you ever get the chance. I mean, you should get this book. All of these you should just read everything Clark Ashton Smith because he's an underrated author that not enough people read, and he's fantastic. What else did we have? We had The Devotee of Evil, that was fun. The Planet of the Dead, that was interesting. Marooned in Andromeda, that was one of his old pulpy science fiction stories. All of his stories are really kind of tense because Clark Ashton Smith he doesn't feel like he needs to end stories happily. Very often, Clark Ashton Smith will have like a really grim and very often a very terrible ending for his characters. And really violent and awful stuff very often happens in Clark Ashton Smith stories. So if you're in a Clark Ashton Smith story, it could go horribly wrong for you. And The Immeasurable Horror was one of his pulpier science fiction stories about exactly that, an immeasurable horror. And very pulpy, but great, just great fun. I mean, there's something about his stories. The plots very often are simple. He tends to have simple plots, but he does a lot with those just because of the beauty of his writing and just how glorious the language is and how he can draw you into his stories. And so the plots are almost secondary. They're kind of like the thing that everything else is built around. But I highly recommend Clark Ashton Smith. This was a great book. And yeah. And I forget which number it is because I can never remember as far as my 500 book challenge, what number it is. So I'll put it down there. I'll just put the numbers up as I talk about the books. So that was the first book that I completed. The next book is for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. I read The Prisoner of Zenda. The Prisoner of Zenda, which is the book we're reading in Roger's Cheap Old Book Club this month. And it's a pretty short book, so it didn't take long to get through. But I really loved it. I'm going to save a detailed review for later on in the month because all this month for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club, you have to read it. And if you want to talk about the book with some others, you can go to my Discord. I'll link that down below. I've got a Discord now, which I created specifically so we could talk about Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. But there's some other fun stuff on there if you want to check it out. But I will say I really, really enjoyed this book. And most of the people that have been reading it along with me seem to be enjoying it as well. Those who have finished it seem to have liked it. Still plenty of time to read this book because, like I said, it's pretty short. And so I think this was actually a really good one to start off with for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. Excellent, excellent story. I had read this once before when I was a teenager, but yeah, I didn't remember a ton about it, but it lives up to the expectation that I had because I remembered this being pretty good. So yeah, The Prisoner of Zenda, I'll talk more about that later on at the end of the month. So what did I read after that? Well, this particular weekend is CriminOlly's Lost Weekend for Garbogust 1.5. So CriminOlly over at his channel, in an attempt to get people excited for Garbogust in August, why would you even need to? Because Garbogust is literally the greatest event of all time that's ever happened on BookTube. But he couldn't wait to read some trash and to share the wonders of trashy fiction with everybody. So this is the Lost Weekend where we're picking a trashy book to read over the weekend. And I thought, you know what, if he's going to promote his awesome BookTube event, I'll promote my awesome BookTube event at the same time, which is June on the Range. So I decided to read a trashy Western, which I did, which is this. This is Edge, the Loner. Edge #1, the Loner. So this was a series of 61 or 63 books? It was a lot of books in this series. And I've got a lot of them. I don't have all of them, but I've got an awful lot of them, which I ordered last Garbogust because CriminOlly was reading all of these books. I don't know if he's finished all of these books, but he was at least reading all the Edge books and talking about the Edge books. And so I decided, you know what? For the Lost Weekend, I'll read the first Edge book, since it's also a Western. And it's actually a lot better than I thought it would be. This is written by George G. Gilman. George G. Gilman, who was an Englishman who wrote Westerns. So it's an English Western. But an excellent one, really. I mean, its whole thing is that it's super violent, right? This is #1 in a violent new series. So they're really, hey, it's violent, man, it's violent. They're really pushing the violence. Edge, without a doubt, he is the meanest, most vicious man you'll ever meet. He's a man born of violence, driven by revenge. You won't forget him. So yeah, he's pretty much a dirty bastard. Edge is not a pleasant fellow, not someone you'd want to run into. This is a tale of revenge, because of course it is. And so yeah, it has a lot of gratuitous violence that's there in the book just to be gratuitous. Violence for violence sake in this book. But at the same time, it's pretty entertaining, and the writing is a lot better than I thought it would be. Very pulpy story, of course, but it was fun, and definitely I'll be continuing the series, of course. I'll be reading more Edge books. I mean, heck, I've got a lot of them. So yeah, this was fun. Edge, The Loner, the book I read for the Wasted Weekend. It's the Wasted Weekend. Yeah, it's CriminOlly's Wasted Weekend. I keep calling it the Lost Weekend, but it's the Wasted Weekend. That's what it officially is. I was too wasted this weekend to remember that that's what it was. So yeah, Edge, The Loner, that was awesome. What else is going on? Okay, so what am I reading right at this very moment? Right at this very moment, I'm reading The Mucker, going right back to Edgar Rice Burroughs. I had to derail the Burroughs deep dive because of my book club, Roger's cheap old book club, with The Prisoner of Zenda by Anthony Hope. And The Loner, Edge, The Loner for the Wasted Weekend. But now I'm back with Edgar Rice Burroughs and The Mucker. The Mucker. So I'm not too far into it. I've just barely started it, but it's going to be an interesting book to talk about. I read this once before, a long time ago. Like I read a lot of these Burroughs books a long time ago. But it's proving to be a very interesting and entertaining book, even though I'm just barely starting it. It's longer for an Edgar Rice Burroughs book. Well, at least compared to the books I've been reading. It's 320 pages. And this was actually at one time cut in half, because it's 2 novellas that make up one novel. And so I've seen Return of the Mucker published as a separate book, but that is in this edition. Still only counts as one book though, because it's The Mucker. So yeah, this is interesting, and it's awful good. So this will be fun to talk about. What am I reading after that? The next thing I'm reading, for Richardson Reads Hornblower Read Along, I'm going to be reading next Lieutenant Hornblower by C.S. Forester. I really loved the first Hornblower book that I read last month, so this is going to be a lot of fun. Lieutenant Hornblower, #2 in the Hornblower saga. Every month I'll be reading a Hornblower book. So this is going to be cool. #2 in Hornblower. There are 11 books in this series, so that'll take me right through the year. So yeah, the read along with Richardson Reads Hornblower. Look forward to that. Then I'll be jumping right back to Edgar Rice Burroughs after that with The Lad and the Lion. The Lad and the Lion. This is still at the beginning of Edgar Rice Burroughs' career, when he kept trying to find the next Tarzan, the next book that would be as successful as Tarzan was. He doesn't realize at this point in his career that he's going to be writing Tarzan books for the rest of his career, as well as sequels to the Mars series and Pellucidar and some of his other famous series. So he's kind of A lot of his standalone novels actually were written around this time in his career, including this one. This never got a sequel, The Lad and the Lion. This is a one-shot right here. Then it's back to the rotation. So I've got some books that I'm rotating, vintage science fiction, Stephen King, some other things. And the first in the rotation is going to be vintage science fiction. So this is the next vintage science fiction book that I'll be reading, Adventures on Other Planets, edited by Donald A. Wollheim. And one of the reasons I'm wearing this fantastic outfit is because it's been pointed out to me that I haven't really read any Westerns since Lonesome Dove, other than Edge. You know, I just read Edge. But otherwise, I haven't read any Westerns since Lonesome Dove, which I started for June on the Range. And it was suggested that I put a Western in the rotation. You know, all these different types of books that I'm rotating. Because, you know, I just don't have enough going on as far as my reading is concerned. And so, yes, I will be adding a Western to the rotation. And this is going to be the next one I read. It'll probably be a few books away. But this is Amos Flagg, Lawman. Amos Flagg, Lawman, by Clay Randall. He was good with a gun. Too damn good. And half the triggermen in Texas would learn it the hard way. This book is a little bow-legged. You'll see it's got a bit of a bow there, but this is the next one I'll be reading. Amos Flagg, Lawman. So that's most of what I read, but let's not forget comics. I read comics as well. And so I have been reading this one. This is Showcase Presents Warlord, which is Mike Grell's Warlord series. Mike Grell wrote and illustrated this comic book, Warlord. And I read the initial issue, which was published in first issue special. And then Warlord got his own comic book, The Lost World of the Warlord. And so this whole thing is in black and white. It's the only way you can get a reprint of this series, because DC, their reprint program sucks, as I've mentioned before and will mention again. DC, your reprint program sucks. If it didn't, we would have a Warlord deluxe hardcover or a Warlord omnibus. That's what we really should have, is a Warlord omnibus. We should have that. This all should be pristine and glorious instead of just black and white newsprint. But I guess I'll take what I can get, because the first 4 issues were a lot of fun. One interesting thing about Mike Grell is he's pretty clear about where he steals from. He steals a lot of ideas for his comic book, and you know, he doesn't try to hide it. This comic book takes place within the inner world, which is a complete ripoff of Pellucidar, right down to the sun, which hangs in the center of the inner world. So he ripped off Pellucidar, and actually in these stories he also ripped off Spartacus quite blatantly, right down to like individual scenes from the film Spartacus he put in his Warlord comic book. That's okay, it's entertaining as hell. I'm really enjoying it. I really like the artwork in this comic. His figures can be a bit stiff on occasion and occasionally a little awkward, but the art other than that is really, really good. And I'm pretty impressed, actually, that he wrote and drew this whole thing. I really like it. I think it holds up and stands out really well. This DC Comics Sword and Sorcery comic book. A lot of fun, Warlord. So I'm still reading that. I've got quite a bit to go. I'm going to be reading some more of that today and tomorrow. And I guess that's all I have to say. You have anything to say? Roger, he's got nothing to say. Imagine that. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.